Okay, so I've never used this program before, but maybe I can get it to work. Chapter 1, Part 6, The Queen's Pavilion. The sawtooth blades of grass directly before Jack's eyes seemed as tall and stiff as sabers. They would cut the wind, not bend to it. Jack groaned as he lifted his head. He did not possess such dignity. His stomach still felt threateningly liquid. His forehead and eyes burned. Jack pushed himself up on his knees and then forced himself to stand. A long, horse-drawn cart tumbled toward him down the dusty track, and its driver, a bearded, red-faced man roughly the same size and shape as the wooden barrels rattling behind him, was staring at him. Jack nodded and tried to take in as much as he could about the man, while giving the appearance of a loafing boy who had perhaps run off for an illicit snooze. Upright, he no longer felt ill. He felt, in fact, better than at any time since leaving Los Angeles. Not merely healthy, but somehow harmonious, mysteriously in tune with his body. The warm, drifting air of the territories patted his face with the gentlest, most fragrant of touches, its own delicate, flowery scent quite distinct beneath the strong odor of raw meat it carried. Jack ran his hands over his face and peeked at the driver of the cart, his first sample of a territories man. If the driver addressed him, how should he answer? Did they even speak English here? His kind of English. For a moment, Jack imagined himself trying to pass unnoticed in a world where people said prithee and dost thou go cross-gartered yonder varlet, and decided that if that's how things went, he'd pretend to be a mute. The driver finally took his eyes off Jack and clucked something decidedly not 1980s American English to his horses, but perhaps that's just the way you spoke to horses. Slusha, slusha. Jack edged backward onto the seagrass, wishing that he had managed to get on his feet a couple seconds earlier. The man glanced at him again and surprised Jack by nodding, a gesture neither friendly nor unfriendly, merely a communication between equals. I'll be glad when this day's work is done, brother. Jack returned the nod, tried to put his hands in his pockets, and for a moment must have looked half-witted with astonishment. The driver laughed, not unpleasantly. Jack's clothes had changed. He wore coarse, voluminous woolen trousers instead of the corduroy jeans. Above the waist, a close-fitting jacket of soft blue fabric covered him instead of buttons. The jacket, a jerkin, he speculated, had a row of cloth hooks and eyes. Like the trousers, it was clearly handmade. The Nikes, too, were gone, replaced by flat leather sandals. The knapsack had been transmogrified into a leather sack held by a thin strap over his shoulder. The cart driver wore clothing almost exactly similar. His jerkin was of leather stained so deeply and continuously that it showed rings within rings, like an old tree's heart. All rattle and dust, the cart pulled past Jack. The barrels radiated a yeasty musk of beer. Behind the barrels stood a triple pile of what Jack unthinkingly took to be truck tires. He smelled the tires and noticed that they were perfectly flawlessly bald in the same moment. It was a creamy odor, full of secrets and subtle pleasures that instantly made him hungry. Cheese. But no cheese that he had ever tasted. Behind the wheels of cheese near the back of the cart, an irregular mound of raw meat, long, peeled-looking sides of beef, big slab-like steaks, a heap of ropey internal organs he couldn't identify, slithered beneath a glistening mat of flies. The powerful smell of raw meat assailed Jack, killing the hunger evoked by the cheese. He moved into the middle of the track after the cart had passed him and watched it jounce toward the crest of a little rise. A second later, he began to follow, walking north. He had only gone halfway up the rise when he stood again and saw the peak. He had only gone up halfway up the rise when once again he saw the peak of the great tent, rigid in the middle of a flank of narrow, fluttering flags. That, he assumed, was his destination. Another few steps past the blackberry bushes where he'd paused the last time, remembering how good they'd been. Jack popped 2 of the enormous berries in his mouth, and he could see the whole of the tent. It was actually a big, rambling pavilion, long wings on each side, with gates and a courtyard. Like the Alhambra, this eccentric structure, a summer palace, Jack's instincts told him, stood just above the ocean. Little bands of people moved through and around the great pavilion, driven by forces as powerful and invisible as the effect on iron fillings of a magnet. The little groups met, divided, poured on again. Some of the men wore bright, rich-looking clothes, though many seemed to be dressed as Jack was. A few women in long, shining white gowns or robes marched through the courtyard as purposeful as generals. Outside the gates stood a collection of smaller tents and impromptu-looking wooden huts. Here, too, people moved, eating or buying or talking, though more easily and randomly. Somewhere down in that busy crowd, he would have to find the man with the scar. But first, he looked behind him down the length of rutted track to see what had happened to Fun World. When he saw 2 small dark horses pulling plows perhaps 50 yards off, he thought that the amusement park had become a farm, but then he noticed the crowd watching the plowing from the top of the hill and understood that this was actually a contest. Next, his eyes were taken on by the spectacle of a huge red-haired man stripped to the waist, whirling about like a top. His outstretched hands held some long, heavy object. The man abruptly stopped, whirling, and released the object, which flew a long way before it thudded and bounced on the grass, revealing itself to be a hammer. Fun World was a fair, not a farm. Jack now saw tables heaped with food, children on their father's shoulders. In the midst of the fair, making sure that every strap and harness was sound, every oven stoked with wood, was there a Speedy Parker? Jack hoped so. And his mother, still sitting by herself in the tea and jam shop, was she still there, wondering why she had let him go? Jack turned back and watched the long cart rattle through the gates of the summer palace and swing to the left, separating the people who moved there as a car making a turn off Fifth Avenue separates pedestrians on a crosstown street. A moment later, he set off after it.